Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington. Now we're talking about the Occupy Wall Street movement, and we're offering critical support to that movement. And the positive side is, of course, anti-Wall Street protest with, as we're hearing, a labor component now for the first time in quite a long time. Obviously, questions of program, leadership, organization have to be raised, and the question of breaking the control mechanisms of the domestic counterinsurgency apparatus, the foundation-funded fakers, and all the rest. So let's go back to Eric now in New York City. So, Eric, previously you were talking to me about this the steering committee that often asserts itself. Can you give us some background on that?
Well, the steering committee, I guess, if you want to use the term, is at the very least something that is very opaque. It's difficult to pin down, and it's difficult to really identify. If you're someone who's down there every day, you start to notice certain faces, certain people whose presence sort of indicates that they have some kind of a leadership role. Now, one thing that you notice about these people, they're, if not completely unwilling, then very, very, very afraid to give names. And without giving names, the secretiveness leads to certain kinds of conclusions that you begin to draw. Who are these people? Where do they come from? Who are they taking orders from? Is there some element here that is controlling this? Now, without any specific evidence to pinpoint anything, what I can say is that there is a group of about, I would say, between 10 and 20 who have been there since the beginning, who really control, I would say, the mechanisms of decision-making. So the way that this works, and I talked about this last week, this General Assembly, but the General Assembly, the ideas that the General Assembly takes up come out of these various subcommittees, these breakout groups, or whatever term that they're using for them. What I'm seeing is that the agenda that is set for these different groups is coming from these individuals who are strategically placed as leaders of these different groups. Now, does that mean that everybody who's involved in them is somehow an agent? No, I don't think so. I think that's oversimplification. But the general direction, the general tenor of these groups is in some way controlled. That being said, what Wednesday demonstrated, and this your listeners have to understand, what we saw on Wednesday was that this grew far bigger than the mechanisms of control could ever contain. When the labor unions got involved, when this became a legitimate mass strike, the Soros foundations, they would never be able to control it. And that is the most useful piece of information that I can provide to people. If you're feeling critical, if you're feeling skeptical or cynical about what's happening down there, you shouldn't be cynical. You should be hopeful, and you should work to help this movement because it is growing at a rate that's faster than the mechanisms of control. Now, one thing that I want to point out, and I cannot give any concrete data, maybe Webster, you might want to give background on this on your own, and that is the presence of what I guess could be called military or ex-military intelligence or something along those lines. There is that presence as well. I've seen, I guess, ex-military people who are in charge of, what can you call it, security or sort of containment. And this is definitely present in Zuccotti Park. Whether or not these people are just, fed up former military people or whether they're agents, I would leave that to other people to decide. Now, are
these people, are they anonymous too? Do they have names or not?
What I've seen is a lot of them have name tags with a first name on them. Whether the first name is real or not is, anybody's guess. So I see a lot of first names. Now, I think the argument could also be made you don't want to give your last name because who knows who might take your last name. The problem with that is you can't answer the questions if you're not willing to give your name. Because if you don't give me your name, how do I know you're not an agent? You see, so this is the difficulty with what's happening down there. Now, I mentioned last week as well, the appearances of people like Michael Moore and even people like Joseph Stiglitz, these should tell you, right, what this should tell you is that the mainstream left has come. They've attempted to sort of impose control, but they're not able to. Because, again, Michael Moore was not well received. Even somebody like Stiglitz, who was well received, still is not able to contain this movement. Last night, I did a teach-in on some of the points that I'll mention here in a second, but at the exact same time, Naomi Klein came down to give a speech at the General Assembly, or right before the General Assembly. And Naomi Klein, I asked from two different representatives. Naomi Klein was not specifically invited to come down there. Supposedly, Naomi Klein, quote-unquote, just shows up. Now, my question
doesn't that indicate then that the Secret Steering Committee is actually issuing invitations that the General Assembly never hears about?
I think that's a reasonable conclusion. Now, I don't know whether the individual young people there would even necessarily have a problem with it, but it should indicate an underlying structure of leadership that is beneath the surface that bears, I think, further investigation, further analysis. Now, I want to move, since I only have a brief period of time here, I want to move to the teach-in that I conducted last night. So the teach-in, unfortunately, we had scheduled it, and then the next day it was announced that Naomi Klein would be giving a talk at the exact same time. So, of course, I was unable to draw, much in terms of a large audience. We had a small audience. I will tell you that every person who was in the audience gave a standing ovation and was absolutely enthusiastic 100% with the program. So what was the program? The first point, and I spent a considerable amount of time talking about this, and this was the student debt issue, and specifically the political demand of amnesty on all student debts. The second point was the Wall Street sales tax of 1%, and then consequently the amount of money that would be generated out of that in order to fund the various other aspects of a progressive and civilized society, such as infrastructure, education, healthcare, and all of the other things that we know we want. And the third point that was focused on in the teach-in was the debate about the Federal Reserve, and specifically, how do you combat the Federal Reserve itself, and also how do you combat the ideology and the sort of the demagogy of the Ron Paul and the Fed factions, because the Ron Paul and Fed movement is also putting together its own sort of teach-in circuit, if you will, in order to propagandize young people about the End the Fed movement and the gold fetishism and all the rest of it. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about what the Federal Reserve is, why it was established, how it functions today, and then how we take control of the powers of credit creation, and instead of having it be concentrated in the private hands of Wall Street, have it concentrated in the hands of the government, that is to say, in the hands of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Again, the idea in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution, it is the responsibility of Congress and of the government to coin money, to the issuance of currency and credit and all of the rest of this. This is not the responsibility of the private Wall Street banks, and this is what the Ron Paul crowd cannot seem to grasp, that ending the Fed does not break the forms of control that Wall Street exerts on credit creation and on the issuance of currency. It simply does not. If you end the Fed and you destroy that institution, you also maintain the Wall Street control. I mean, it stands
absolutely.
So instead, what it was that I was suggesting at this teach-in in my presentation was the nationalization of the Fed, which I know that you've argued for in the past, specifically on the model of Alexander Hamilton and the Bank of the United States. Because if you follow that model, you get all of the benefits of a national central bank minus all of the sort of the problems that are associated with Wall Street and Wall Street's control of credit creation.
Okay, congratulations on that teaching, Eric. I believe some of that will be available at INN, am I right?
And also, please, your audience needs to follow me on Twitter at Stop Imperialism. That's at Stop Imperialism.
Okay, and this was all broadcast live on INN. I heard people in Colorado who had been following it. They were enthusiastic. We'll see you again next week, Eric. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Webster.